Our last macronutrient is largely the most popular considering our phobias of carbs and fats, and it's protein. It plays thousands of roles in the body. It's involved with regulation, maintenance. Every enzyme is a protein. A small role is to provide energy, but we don't want to use our proteins for too much energy. We want to put it to use structurally and functionally. Like carbohydrates, protein yields 4 calories per gram, and proteins are comprised of amino acid building blocks, the arrangement of which determine the shape and function of the eventual protein. Each amino acid looks the same from the neck down. It's got a carboxyl group, an amino group containing nitrogen, and a hydrogen surrounding what we call a chiral carbon there in the middle. The fourth binding site to this carbon is where the R group lives, and there are 20 different R groups making 20 different amino acids. You might be wondering, how did the nitrogen get there? Carbohydrates and lipids don't have this, and the answer is plants. All amino acids originally are made by plants, even if we get lots of our protein from our animal products. So here's a look at the 20 different amino acids. Notice that some are acidic, some basic, some polar, nonpolar, ringed, non-ringed. These characteristics end up determining the shape of the protein. Also, notice the dashed rings surrounding 9 of these amino acids. These are the essential amino acids. And just like essential fatty acids, we can't make these ourselves. We need to consume them in our diet. Let's take a little step back here and recall back in biology how proteins are made to begin with. Our DNA is coding for different amino acids by way of mRNA, and amino acids are pieced together by ribosomes to form proteins. The opposite is occurring during digestion. We use stomach acidity and proteases in the small intestine to break these amino acids down so that we can absorb them, and then they end up in our bloodstream. Now be sure to watch the Nutrition Facts video on protein requirements over time. It's an interesting story of how we've gotten to this point, into this slide. But the recommendations for our requirements are based on our body size. So 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight that we weigh. But if we're exercising and breaking down and rebuilding tissue, then we need more. No matter how many weights that you're lifting, though, you shouldn't consume more than 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. Excess protein will be converted to fat, and in order to do so, the nitrogen-containing amino group must be removed and sent over to the kidneys via the urea cycle so that it can be urinated out. But this can be very toxic to the kidney in high amounts. It can cause the kidney to water down the toxicity literally by taking more water from our blood and making us dehydrated. So those on high protein diets must maintain their hydration status, which is why you see people wearing gym clothes carrying around gallon jugs of water everywhere they go. Timing also appears to matter. It's recommended to spread protein intake out across a day with about 0.3 grams per kilogram of body weight every 3 to 4 hours. And this recommendation typically will go for athletes and active individuals, which everybody should be an active individual. Overall, the USDA recommends about 10 to 35% of calories to come from protein. So how about the quality or source of proteins? Here are the 2015-2020 guidelines by the USDA, and they are promoting a shift away from red meat and processed meat and to incorporate seafood and more nutrient-dense options like legumes, nuts, seeds, and other plant-based proteins. And many of you have heard about this report in 2015 in which the World Health Organization categorized processed meat as a group 1 carcinogen, meaning it's carcinogenic to humans, and red meat as a group 2 carcinogen, which is probably carcinogenic to humans. They cited a paper of over 800 studies that showed that for every 50 grams of processed meat that you consume, you increase colorectal cancer risk by 18%. It's no wonder that colorectal cancer is the number 3 cancer in America. Processed meat is defined as being transformed through salting, curing, fermentation, smoking, and this includes most lunch meats, hot dogs, and sausages. Now, a complete protein source is a meal that contains all of those essential amino acids, while an incomplete protein source does not. A lot has been made about the significance of this, with many advocating protein combining to complement sources of plant proteins in order to achieve a protein source. Think rice and beans together, they would equal a complete protein source. However, this strategy is now thought to be unnecessary. Our body has reservoirs of amino acids in our blood and muscle called amino acid pools. And we take from these pools when we're building new proteins, and we add to them when we are breaking down proteins. This means that it's not necessary to ensure that our meals are always complete. It's rare to run low on individual amino acids. And another reason is that we have 90 grams of endogenous protein per day flowing through our digestive tract in the form of saliva, gastric secretions, bile, pancreatic secretions, and enzymes, and mucins, and epithelial cells, plasma proteins, dead bacteria. 80% of this ends up getting reabsorbed and sent back into the amino acid pool. So because of this massive protein recycling program we have, we might not be consuming a complete protein source, but the net effect could be a replenishment of all of the essential amino acids. While children need 40% of their total protein requirement to be supplied by essential amino acids, it drops at adolescence to 20%, and adults actually only need 11% of their total protein requirement to be supplied by essential amino acids. It's been stated that meat sources are a better source of protein than plant proteins, but this actually isn't the case. In fact, it would be near impossible to design a plant-based diet which is proficient in total protein but deficient in certain essential amino acids. By having a plant-based diet diverse with different plants, you end up getting all of them anyway. Many meat and mortality studies have led researchers to try to uncover the mechanisms for why conditions like cancer and heart disease might be elevated in those consuming lots of meat. And this particular study looked at IGF-1, our body's most potent growth hormone, as well as the IGF-1 binding protein levels in meat eaters, vegetarians, and vegans. And it appears that upon consumption of animal protein, the liver, which is the first organ to see our food once it's absorbed, the liver releases IGF-1. And that IGF-1, that's insulin-like growth factor, goes around and tells the cells of the body to grow, including the cancer cells. In fact, those with a genetic defect in which they can't produce very much IGF-1, nobody in this population has even had a case of cancer. So interestingly, bodybuilders want lots of IGF-1 since that's the hormone most responsible for muscle hypertrophy. They aren't all keeling over with cancer, so perhaps the damaged muscle acts as a sponge to soak up the IGF-1, keeping it away from cancer cells. Maybe it's another reason to exercise, but future studies will tell us whether that's the case or not. This study sought to identify if varying levels of protein intake was associated with the risk of heart disease, our, of course, number one killer of Americans. After 44,000 people were surveyed with a food frequency questionnaire, and about 3,000 of whom had had heart disease, the results showed no links between total protein intake and heart disease risk, but it did show that a higher animal protein intake was associated with increased heart disease risk. And you might be saying, yeah, well, animal protein has saturated fat attached to it, so of course the heart disease risk is going to be increased. And they thought that too, and after running an analysis to control for saturated fat, the results still held up. It turned out the higher vegetable protein was associated with a decreased risk for heart disease. And after this study was done, a similar prostate cancer study was performed, and it had the same exact results. So cancer cells appear to be dependent upon a particular amino acid called methionine for survival and proliferation. And methionine restriction has been shown to inhibit cancer cell growth and extend lifespan, But what is a methionine-restricted diet? Well, you can reduce your total calorie intake, you can reduce your total protein intake since it's an amino acid, or since methionine is found in much greater quantities in animal proteins, a plant-based diet rich in plant-based proteins and lower in animal-based proteins may prove to be a very useful strategy in cancer growth control, and as may the development of a drug to reduce methionine in the blood. Be sure to watch the video on leucine restriction as well. I'm going to post that on Canvas as it follows a similar story, that one related to aging and lifespan and protein intake.